November 7, 2004. The outskirts of Fallujah, Iraq. Lieutenant Colonel Willard Bull looked at his battalion of Marines and told them what they were about to do in the direct language that Marine commanders use when the situation does not permit anything less than complete honesty. They were going into Fallujah. Fallujah was a city of 300,000 people on the Euphrates River approximately 50 miles west of Baghdad, and had been under the control of a coalition of Sunni insurgents and foreign fighters affiliated with Al-Qaeda since April 2004, when the first American attempt to clear the city had been stopped by political pressure before it could be completed. In the 8 months since then, the insurgents had fortified every building, mined every street, turned every mosque and every hospital and every school into a fighting position, and prepared the city for exactly the kind of assault that was now being planned. They had had 8 months to prepare. The Marines who were going in had had 8 months to watch them prepare and to plan around what they were building. The intelligence picture of Fallujah's defenses was more complete than the intelligence for any previous urban assault in the Iraq War. American aircraft had been watching the city for months, and the photographs showed what the insurgents had done. Spider holes connecting buildings at street level so that fighters could move from block to block without exposure. Booby traps on doors and windows, manufactured from artillery shells and mortar rounds and improvised devices of such variety and ingenuity that the ordnance disposal teams who would support the assault had catalogued dozens of distinct types. Snipers positioned in every minaret and every elevated position with fields of fire that covered the approach routes to the city. The force that was going into Fallujah consisted of approximately 10,000 American and Iraqi soldiers, the largest urban assault operation since the Battle of Fallujah City in Vietnam in 1968. The core of the force was 2 Marine regiments, the 1st Marines and the 8th Marines, whose rifle companies would do the actual clearing of the city block by block and building by building. Army soldiers of the 2nd Infantry Division would seal the eastern side of the city. Iraqi army battalions would participate in the clearing operations, their presence intended to give the operation the character of an Iraqi government action rather than a purely American military operation. The plan that Colonel Michael Shupp, commanding the 1st Marine Regiment, had developed for the assault was designed to minimize American casualties while achieving the complete clearance of the city that the 1st April operation had not accomplished. Marine rifle companies would not enter a building until it had been suppressed by direct fire from tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles. No Marines would cross open ground if there was any alternative route. The advance would be slow and methodical rather than fast, accepting the time cost in exchange for the casualty cost that speed would produce. The assault began on the night of November 7th to 8th with airstrikes and artillery that continued through the night to suppress the defensive positions that had been identified and to create the psychological conditions for the ground assault that would begin at dawn. At 7 a.m. on November 8th, the 1st Marine companies crossed the railroad berm on the northern edge of Fallujah and entered the city. The fighting that began in the first hours of November 8th was urban combat at its most intimate and most brutal, the kind of fighting where the enemy is on the other side of a wall and the only way to know if the next room is clear is to go into it. The insurgents who had prepared Fallujah's defenses for 8 months had created a defensive system whose complexity and density exceeded anything American forces had encountered in the Iraq War to that point. The booby traps were the first lethal surprise. Buildings that appeared clear were triggered when Marines entered. Devices that had been placed on door handles and floorboards and windowsills and in every location that a man clearing a building would touch or step on or disturb. The Marines learned quickly that every building required a systematic search before it could be entered, a process that slowed the advance and created the specific tension of men who knew that any surface they touched might be the last surface they touched. The spider holes that connected buildings at street level allowed insurgent fighters to move between positions after being engaged in one location, emerging from holes in walls and floors to fire from positions that the Marines had already cleared and believed were behind them. The tactic of fighting from a position, withdrawing through the tunnel system when the pressure became too great, and reappearing in a position that had already been cleared required the Marines to treat every cleared building as potentially hostile until the spider hole system in that building had been found and destroyed. Corporal Jared Neff of Kilo Company 3rd Battalion 1st Marines described clearing buildings in Fallujah in terms that captured the specific character of the fighting. "You stacked on the door," he said. "The point man went in first. You followed. You cleared the room. You cleared the next room. You cleared the stairway. You cleared the roof. And then you found the hole in the wall to the next building and you started over. Every building. Every room. Every time." The insurgents who chose to stand and fight rather than withdraw through the tunnel system were positioned in fighting positions that had been prepared for exactly this kind of assault. Reinforced firing positions that could survive direct fire from rifles and machine guns required the heavier weapons that the Marine companies had available, tank rounds and javelin missiles and Mark 19 grenade launchers. Weapons that could defeat the reinforced positions but that required the careful judgment of when to use them in a city full of buildings that might contain civilians. The question of civilians was the constant ethical weight that the battle carried. The vast majority of Fallujah's civilian population had left the city in the weeks before the assault, warned by leaflets and radio announcements and the visible military build-up that an assault was coming. But not everyone had left. Some had stayed because they were too old or too sick to leave. Some had stayed because they had nowhere to go. Some had stayed because they did not believe the warnings. The Marines who found civilians in buildings that had been used as defensive positions faced the specific moral complexity of urban warfare, the knowledge that the people in front of them were not combatants and that the building they were in had been used by combatants and that every subsequent building in the block might present the same situation. They treated the civilians they found with the careful attention that the rules of engagement required and that their own moral standards demanded. Civilians were moved from the buildings, treated for any medical conditions that were found, and transferred to the civil affairs units that were following the assault element. The care that the Marines took with civilians in the middle of one of the most intense urban battles in American military history was noted by the Iraqi army soldiers who were fighting alongside them and by the journalists who were embedded with the assault force. The hardest day of the battle was November 9th, the second day of the assault, when the insurgent resistance was at its most organized and the terrain was at its most difficult. The insurgents who had retreated from the initial assault positions had organized secondary defensive lines in the city's central districts, using the buildings and the street network to create kill zones that the advancing Marine companies had to fight through. Sergeant Rafael Peralta was one of the Marines who died on November 15th in circumstances that have been debated ever since with the particular intensity that Medal of Honor decisions attract. Peralta's company was clearing houses in the southern Fallujah district when they entered a room and a grenade was thrown at the clearing party. Peralta, who had been shot and was already on the floor, pulled the grenade under his body. 3 Marines who were behind him survived. Whether his action was deliberate or a muscular reflex from his wounds has been argued in the Marine Corps and the Department of Defense in the year since, with different commanders reaching different conclusions. What is not debated is the outcome. The Marines behind him survived. The argument about whether his action was deliberate is ultimately the wrong question. The right question is what happened and who survived because of it. 3 Marines survived who might not have. That is the essential fact. The city of Fallujah was declared cleared on November 16th, 8 days after the assault began. The pace of clearing, approximately 1 to 2 city blocks per day, reflected the methodical approach that the Marine Command had specified and that the insurgent defenses had required. The casualty figures from the battle reflected the cost of taking a city that had been prepared for exactly this kind of assault. 95 American soldiers and Marines were killed and 560 were wounded in the 8 days of fighting. Iraqi army casualties were 11 killed and 43 wounded. Insurgent casualties were estimated at approximately 1,200 to 1,500 killed, with an unknown number of wounded. The proportions of the casualty exchange reflected the combined arms proficiency that the American force had developed over 3 years of Iraq War combat. The tanks and Bradleys and air support that suppressed defensive positions before infantry entered them reduced the American casualties that a pure infantry assault would have produced. The methodical clearing procedures that required each building to be searched before entry reduced the booby trap casualties that a faster approach would have generated. The battle also produced a tactical lesson about urban warfare that influenced American military doctrine for the subsequent decade. The insurgent use of tunnel systems connecting buildings within blocks and between blocks was a defensive technique that no American training scenario had adequately simulated. The response that the Marines developed, the systematic search and destruction of tunnel systems as a component of the clearing process, became standard procedure for subsequent urban operations. General George Casey, commanding multinational force Iraq, assessed the Battle of Fallujah in his after-action review as the most significant American ground combat operation since the Gulf War, both for what it accomplished militarily and for what it demonstrated about the capability of American forces in urban combat. The Marines who cleared Fallujah had not been specifically trained for the kind of fighting they encountered, Casey noted. They adapted to it in real time, developed new techniques under fire, and executed a complex clearing operation with a precision and a care for civilian casualties that set a standard for urban warfare that will influence military doctrine for decades. He was right about the adaptation and the precision. What he could not fully capture in the language of operational assessment was the specific human quality that the adaptation reflected, which was the quality of men who encountered a situation that their training had not fully prepared them for and who figured out what was needed and did it. They cleared the buildings. They destroyed the tunnel systems. They found and secured the civilians. They treated the wounded, their own and the enemy's. They brought out their dead. 8 days. 2 square miles. 1,500 insurgents and 95 Americans. The city was cleared. The insurgents who had prepared Fallujah for 8 months with the absolute conviction that the fortifications they had built were adequate to stop an American assault discovered that they were not adequate. The buildings that had been reinforced, the tunnels that had been dug, the spider holes that allowed movement between positions, the booby traps that were supposed to bleed the assault force dry, none of it was sufficient to stop Marines who adapted to each obstacle and kept advancing. They kept advancing. That is the single thing about Fallujah that the insurgents had not adequately accounted for. American Marines, in urban terrain that was specifically designed to kill them, with weapons on every surface and enemies on every floor, kept advancing. They were going to clear the city. Nothing that had been built in 8 months of preparation was going to change that. They cleared it.